Some people mistake quietness for weakness, forgetting that the quietest rooms in the world belong to strategic intelligence. For 15 years, my life was measured in knots, maritime coordinates, and shifting coastal boundaries. While my family gathered for lavish Sunday dinners, boasting about real estate portfolios, corporate promotions, and the superficial markers of civilian success, I sat at a metal desk under fluorescent lights, tracking global shipping lanes and defense infrastructure. They viewed my career in naval intelligence as a quaint, low-paying government hobby, an administrative position that required long hours for little financial return. To them, wealth was the only metric of value, and because my contribution couldn't be measured in luxury vehicles or stock portfolios, I was effectively invisible. They smiled at me with an insufferable, patronizing pity, convinced that my choice to serve meant I lacked the ambition to compete in their high-stakes world of property development and commercial enterprise. My sister, Clara, was the architect of this perception, a woman whose entire identity was built on aggressive acquisition and material display. Her husband, Richard, a man who spoke exclusively in the jargon of commercial zoning and venture capital, viewed the world as a grid of monetizable assets. For years, they had cast a hungry eye on the family's crown jewel, a vast, pristine stretch of coastal land in Cornwall that had belonged to our family for 4 generations. It wasn't just beautiful. It was a highly valuable strategic plot overlooking a critical deepwater channel. My mother, fragile and increasingly dependent on Clara's structured presence, lived in the old stone house that anchored the property. I watched from a distance, tied to my duties at the naval base as Clara and Richard slowly, methodically isolated her, filtering the information she received, convincing her that the world outside was dangerous and that they were her only true protectors. The dynamic shifted irreversibly on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, during a rare weekend leave I managed to secure. I arrived at the family home to find Clara, Richard, and a private solicitor sitting around the heavy mahogany dining table, documents spread out like a battle map. The atmosphere was thick with a synthetic, performative warmth that immediately set off every analytical alarm I possessed. Clara didn't look up immediately. She was guiding our mother's trembling hand along the signature line of a thick, notarized document. When she finally raised her eyes, her smile was sharp, victorious, and devoid of genuine warmth. She handed me a copy of the modified deed with a casual, dismissive gesture, as if she were giving me a restaurant menu rather than a legal document that altered our family's history. My sister smiled as she handed me the modified will, saying my military pension should be enough to keep me happy. She forgot to check the maritime zoning laws that my office rewrote last November. I stood there in my dress uniform, the rain dripping from my cap, reading the cold, legalistic text. They had transferred the entire coastal estate into a private corporate entity controlled entirely by Clara and Richard, completely omitting my name from the title. The justification, written between the lines of legal jargon, was clear. Because I had chosen a path of public service, because I hadn't invested capital into the maintenance of the estate, I had forfeited my right to the inheritance. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers, adjusting his expensive watch with an air of absolute finality. He told me, with a patronizing tone that felt like a physical slap, that a naval officer had no practical use for prime commercial real estate, and that they were doing what was best for the family's financial future. My mother looked away, unable to meet my eyes, her silence a heartbreaking betrayal, completely subjugated by their aggressive certainty. They expected an outburst. They expected me to scream, to threaten legal action, to display the raw, unbridled anger of someone who had just been systematically robbed by their own flesh and blood. But naval intelligence teaches you to control your breathing, to master your micro-expressions, and to never reveal your hand until the trap is fully sprung. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't argue. I simply looked at the deed, noted the precise geographic coordinates of the coastal boundary, and felt a cold, calm certainty wash over me. They thought they could sell the family heritage to a commercial developer and leave me with nothing. They didn't realize the Department of Defense had already flagged that exact coastline, and I held the keys to the lock. I folded the document neatly, placed it back on the table, and looked directly into Clara's triumphant eyes. I told them I understood perfectly, thanked my mother for her hospitality, and walked out into the pouring rain. As my car pulled away from the estate, the global positioning system on my dashboard flickered, tracking the proximity of the naval base just 12 miles up the coast. Clara and Richard believed they had achieved a flawless legal checkmate, securing a multi-million-pound development deal with a luxury resort conglomerate. They were already celebrating their brilliant maneuver, completely unaware that their entire strategy was built on a foundation of sand. They had looked at my quiet demeanor, my modest salary, and my lack of corporate aggression, and concluded I was powerless. They failed to understand that true power doesn't scream, it doesn't boast, and it certainly doesn't require a signature on a civilian deed to control the landscape. The game hadn't ended, it had just transitioned to an arena where they had no standing, no clearance, and absolutely no defense. To understand how we arrived at that rainy afternoon of betrayal, one must understand the years of invisible labor that preceded it. For nearly 2 decades, my life was defined by absolute discipline and a total absence of public recognition. While Clara was ascending the ranks of a prominent London real estate firm, her successes celebrated with champagne toasts and features in industry magazines, I was operating in the shadows of the Ministry of Defense. My specialization was maritime security infrastructure, specifically, the legal and physical protection of deepwater access points along the British coastline. It is a world where success is measured by the crises that don't happen, by the threats that are neutralized before they ever reach the public consciousness. It is a lonely, demanding profession that requires an absolute sacrifice of personal ego. My family, however, possessed no framework for understanding this kind of work. To them, if a job didn't produce a visible, luxurious dividend, it was essentially worthless. Every holiday gathering followed the same predictable, painful script. Richard would dominate the conversation, loudly discussing his latest commercial acquisitions, the fluctuating interest rates, and his strategies for bypassing local environmental regulations to maximize square footage. Clara would chime in, detailing the elite guest lists of her corporate galas, ensuring everyone knew exactly how much influence she wielded in civilian circles. Then invariably, the eyes at the table would turn to me, sitting quietly in my understated civilian attire or my formal uniform, and the tone would instantly drop into one of patronizing condescension. Still doing the desk work for the Navy, a leaner. Richard would ask, a smug, pitying smile playing on his lips. It's admirable, really, public service. It's just a shame the government doesn't compensate you for your dedication. If you ever want to make some real money, I suppose we could find a place for you in the logistics department at the firm. Administrative skills are transferable after all. Clara would offer a soft, insincere laugh, adding that it was probably for the best, as I didn't have the stomach for the aggressive nature of the private sector. My mother, completely conditioned by their material success, would sigh and nod, telling me she wished I had chosen a more stable, lucrative path like my sister. I would simply take a sip of my water, smile politely, and let the comments wash over me. I felt no need to explain the nature of my work, nor could I, given the classification levels attached to my daily operations. The property in question, the coastal estate known as Blackwood Crest, was more than just land to me. It was where our father had taught me to read the tides, to understand the raw, unyielding power of the ocean. He had been a seafaring man himself, a merchant captain who understood that land was temporary, but the sea was eternal. When he passed away, he left the property to our mother with the explicit, spoken understanding that it would remain a sanctuary for both his daughters. But father had been gone for 10 years, and memories fade quickly when subjected to the corrosive influence of greed. Clara and Richard saw Blackwood Crest not as a sanctuary, but as a massive, underutilized asset. It possessed over a mile of unobstructed coastline, a deepwater cove, and a geographical positioning that made it a prime target for a high-end luxury resort development. For 3 years, Richard had been secretly negotiating with an international consortium of developers, drafting blueprints for an exclusive marina, luxury villas, and a private helipad. The only obstacle to their multi-million-pound windfall was my potential inheritance of half the property. They knew that I would never consent to the destruction of the natural coastline, nor would I allow our father's legacy to be paved over for commercial profit. And so, they began the quiet process of erasure. They convinced our mother that my long absences on deployment or at secure facilities were a sign of abandonment. They whispered in her ear that I didn't care about the family home, that I was detached from her needs, and that if the estate were left to me, it would fall into disrepair due to my lack of financial resources. I watched this psychological campaign unfold during my brief visits home. I noticed how my mother's gaze became increasingly guarded, how she began to apologize for things that required no apology, and how Clara systematically took control of her mail, her medical appointments, and her financial accounts. It was a classic textbook isolation tactic, performed with a chilling corporate efficiency. I tried to warn my mother to gently remind her of father's wishes, but Clara had built a wall of dependency around her that I could not breach without causing a major, destabilizing family conflict. I was constrained by my own sense of duty and military decorum. I refused to engage in a sordid, screaming match over money and property. When the trap was finally sprung on that rainy Tuesday, it was clear they had planned the timing meticulously. They chose a moment when I was exhausted from a grueling, 3-week analytical rotation at the base, assuming my mental defenses would be low. The document they forced my mother to sign didn't just alter her will. It executed an immediate transfer of the property title to a newly formed holding company, effectively rendering my mother a tenant in her own home and completely stripping me of any future claim to the land. They had executed a hostile takeover of our family history, presenting it to me as a fait accompli. As I drove away from Blackwood Crest that day, the sense of personal betrayal was profound, but it was immediately superseded by an intense, analytical clarity. They believed they had won because they played by the rules of civilian real estate law. They had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath their feet had already changed. The following morning, I stood in the highly secure briefing room of the Maritime Infrastructure Protection Command. The walls were lined with high-resolution satellite imagery, hydrographic charts, and digital overlays of the British coastline. My team had been working for over a year on Project Aegis, a comprehensive, classified restructuring of national maritime defense zones in response to escalating gray zone security threats in the North Atlantic. The objectives of this project were absolute, dictated by national security mandates that superseded all local, regional, and national civilian zoning authorities. As the lead intelligence architect for this sector, it was my responsibility to finalize the geographic boundaries of the non-negotiable defense easements. I booted up the central terminal and called up the specific sector mapping for the Cornwall coastline. I zoomed in on the precise coordinates of Blackwood Crest. On the screen, the deepwater channel running parallel to our family's land glowed in a vibrant, ominous amber. For months, our acoustic sensors and underwater surveillance arrays had flagged this specific channel as a critical bottleneck, a vulnerability that required the immediate installation of a permanent, shore-based naval monitoring facility and a restricted maritime exclusion zone. The coastal cliffs of Blackwood Crest were the only viable geographical location for this infrastructure. In November of the previous year, under my direct supervision, the Ministry of Defense had quietly drafted and finalized the statutory instruments for the Maritime Defense Act. This legislation granted the Navy absolute, permanent authority to seize control of, restrict development on, and utilize any coastal land designated as a critical security buffer. The easement was absolute. It prohibited any commercial construction, any modification of the shoreline, any private marine docking facilities, and any non-authorized maritime traffic within 3 nautical miles of the coast. It didn't matter who owned the deed. The Crown held an unyielding, permanent right of enforcement that effectively reduced the commercial value of the land to zero. I sat in the dim light of the terminal, looking at the corporate name Clara and Richard had registered on the new deed, Apex Atlantic Holdings. The name appeared on my screen as a tiny, insignificant blip within the newly established defense sector. A profound sense of irony settled over me. If they had included me on the deed, if they had treated me with an ounce of familial respect or professional decency, I would have been legally obligated to disclose the upcoming classification of the land. I would have warned them that investing their entire corporate capital into a luxury resort project on this site was financial suicide. But by systematically cutting me out, by operating in absolute secrecy to rob me of my inheritance, they had severed that ethical obligation. They had locked themselves into a room with a ticking clock, and they had thrown away the key. 3 days later, Richard, completely unaware of the looming storm, finalized the sale contract with the International Development Consortium. From my intelligence feeds, I watched the public corporate filings as Apex Atlantic Holdings accepted a massive leveraged loan from a major London investment bank to fund the initial phase of construction. They had put up their entire existing corporate portfolio, including Clara's personal assets and their luxury London residence, as collateral to secure the funding for the Blackwood Crest Resort project. They were completely overextended, betting everything on the certainty that this coastal land would yield a massive return. They had even hired heavy machinery, bulldozers, and drilling rigs, scheduling them to arrive at the estate within the week to begin clearing the ancient coastal woodland our father had protected for decades. I received a celebratory, venomous text message from Clara on Friday evening. It read, "Construction begins on Monday, Alina. We've secured the future of Blackwood Crest. I suggest you focus on your Navy career as you won't be welcome on the property going forward. We need to maintain a professional environment for the investors." I stared at the message on my encrypted phone, feeling a cold detachment. I didn't reply. Instead, I picked up my secure landline and called the captain of the port and the regional commander of the Naval Engineering Corps. I informed them that the classified defense easement for Sector 4 Bravo was now active, and that a civilian entity was preparing to initiate unauthorized ground disruption within the restricted zone. I requested the immediate deployment of an enforcement detachment to secure the perimeter. The tension within me wasn't born of fear, but of a profound appreciation for the unyielding mechanisms of the state. Clara and Richard operated in a world of contracts, signatures, and civilian courts, believing that a clever lawyer could solve any problem. They had no conception of the absolute, uncompromising nature of national defense infrastructure. When the military moves, it doesn't file lawsuits, it issues directives backed by the full sovereignty of the nation. I spent the weekend preparing the official enforcement files, ensuring every legal cross was dotted and every geographical T was crossed. One major hidden reveal remained entirely within my secure database. The actual signing authority for the enforcement order didn't belong to some distant bureaucrat in London. As the regional director of the Maritime Infrastructure Protection Command, the final signature required to authorize the immediate, permanent military seizure of the Blackwood Crest coastline was mine. Monday morning arrived with a crisp, biting wind off the Atlantic. I dressed in my working digital camouflage uniform, stepping away from the formal dress whites, preparing for the field execution of the directive. I drove toward Blackwood Crest, arriving just as the sun was beginning to break through the gray coastal fog. The scene at the estate was exactly as I had anticipated. Two massive yellow excavators stood at the entrance of the coastal path, their engines idling with a low, rumbling vibration that shook the damp earth. A team of surveyors and construction foremen were gathered around Richard, who was gesturing grandly toward the cliffs, directing them to begin clearing the perimeter fence. Clara stood nearby, wrapped in an expensive wool coat, holding a clipboard, looking like the absolute monarch of all she surveyed. When my military vehicle pulled into the driveway, followed closely by two heavy-wheeled tactical vehicles bearing the insignia of the Royal Navy Police, the construction workers immediately stopped what they were doing. The low rumble of the excavators seemed to falter against the sudden, disciplined presence of the uniform. Richard's face flushed with an immediate volatile anger when he saw me step out of the vehicle. He marched toward me, his expensive leather boots sinking into the mud, his voice cutting through the morning air with a sharp, arrogant edge. "What is the meaning of this, Alina?" he demanded, pointing a finger at the tactical vehicles. "This is private property. We have a registered deed, a valid commercial permit, and full legal authority to begin construction. You cannot use your government vehicle or your little military friends to intimidate us because you're bitter about being left out of the will. Get these vehicles off our land immediately, or I will have my legal team contact your commanding officer before the noon hour." Clara walked up behind him, her expression a mix of irritation and cold amusement. "Alina, please don't make a scene in front of our contractors," she said, her voice dripping with artificial condescension. "We know you're upset. We know you feel entitled to this land, but the law is the law. You chose a career that pays pennies and you don't have the resources to maintain an estate like this. Walk away now, preserve what little dignity you have left in that uniform." I didn't answer them immediately. I walked past them, my boots clicking firmly against the wet gravel, and approached the lead construction foreman. I handed him a thick, red-bound document bearing the official seal of the Ministry of Defense and the prominent classification markings of Project Aegis. The foreman took the document, his eyes widening as he read the first page. His professional demeanor shifted instantly from obedience to Richard to absolute defensive caution. He looked at the naval police officers standing at absolute attention behind me, then looked back at the document. "What is that?" Richard shouted, stepping between me and the foreman, snatching the document out of his hands. "This is nonsense, some bureaucratic nonsense. We have a civilian development clearance from the county council." "Read page 4, Richard," I said, my voice calm, level, and entirely devoid of emotion. "You'll find that the county council's authority was superseded by a statutory instrument signed into law last November. This entire coastal strip, extending 1 mile inland from the high-water mark, has been designated as a critical naval defense buffer. It falls under a permanent, non-negotiable maritime defense easement." Richard laughed, a nervous, defensive sound that lacked any real conviction. "An easement? So what? We can build around a pipeline or a cable layout, we'll just adjust the blueprints." "It's not a utility easement, Richard," I replied, looking him directly in the eyes, watching the first shadows of realization begin to form in his expression. "It is a national security exclusion zone. It prohibits the construction of any permanent civilian structures, any modification of the topography, and any commercial enterprise. The Navy is taking immediate possession of the cliff face to construct an automated acoustic tracking array. Your development permit is null and void. Your access to the coastline is permanently revoked." Clara stepped forward, her face turning a pale, sickly color as she grasped the implications of what I was saying. "That's impossible," she stammered, her corporate confidence fracturing in real time. "We've already signed the contract. We've accepted the development loan. The bank holds the collateral. If we can't build, the consortium will sue us for breach of contract, and the bank will foreclose on everything we own." "You're lying. You're doing this out of spite." "I don't operate on spite, Clara," I said quietly, the narrative pressure in the driveway reaching a suffocating intensity. "I operate on data, intelligence, and national law. If you had bothered to include me in the family discussions, if you hadn't hidden the deed modification from me, you would have known about the zoning reclassification months ago. But you were so consumed by the prospect of a multi-million-pound payout, so desperate to ensure I received nothing, that you rushed the execution without performing basic military infrastructure due diligence." The foreman turned to his crew, his voice loud and clear. "Shut down the engines," he commanded. "We're leaving the site. We're not getting caught between the Ministry of Defense and a broken contract. Pack it up." The low, rumbling engines of the excavators died, replaced by a sudden heavy silence that felt like a physical weight dropping onto the estate. Richard stood frozen, staring at the red-bound document in his hands, his fingers trembling as he finally reached the signature page at the back. He looked at the typed name of the authorizing director, then looked up at me, his mouth opening slightly but producing no sound. The deeper layer of truth had finally exposed itself. The signature that had just destroyed his entire financial life belonged to the quiet sister he had offered a logistics job to just months prior. The silence that followed the shutdown of the construction equipment was absolute, broken only by the steady, rhythmic crash of the Atlantic waves against the cliffs below. Richard's hands dropped to his sides, the red-bound document fluttering in the damp wind. Clara looked from her husband's pale, defeated face to me, her eyes wild with a mixture of terror and sudden, desperate comprehension. The status reversal was complete, absolute, and undeniable. In the span of 10 minutes, they had gone from high-powered real estate tycoons executing a flawless family betrayal to financially ruined individuals completely exposed to the unyielding weight of the state. "Eleanor," Clara whispered, her voice losing all of its sharp, corporate authority, replaced by a fragile, pleading tone that I had never heard from her before. "Eleanor, you can't let them do this. Talk to your superiors. Tell them there's been a mistake. Tell them this is our family land. If this easement stands, Richard and I lose everything. The firm will collapse, our house in London, our savings, mother's security. Everything is tied to this development. Surely you have the influence to move the array further down the coast. You're our sister." I looked at her, seeing her clearly for the first time in years. Not as the intimidating, successful older sibling who had dominated my childhood, but as a small, desperate woman whose entire sense of self-worth was built on a foundation of stolen material advantage. I felt no joy in her ruin, no petty satisfaction in her terror. I felt only the profound, calm validation of a life spent in service to something larger than personal greed. "When you handed me that modified deed on Rainy Tuesday," I said, my voice echoing slightly against the stone walls of our mother's house, "you told me that my military pension should be enough to keep me happy. You told me that a naval officer had no use for family land. You didn't view me as a sister then, you viewed me as a liability to be excised from the balance sheet. You forgot that the state doesn't care about your contracts and national security doesn't negotiate with private equity. Richard stepped forward, his eyes hollow, completely drained of the arrogant energy that had defined him for decades. Please, Eleanor, he said, his voice a low, broken murmur. There must be an administrative appeal process, a variance, a compensation clause. The government must pay for the easement. The government will pay fair market value for the specific acreage utilized for the tracking array, I replied coldly. But since the land is now zoned as a non-commercial military buffer, its market value is negligible. It will cover perhaps a fraction of your initial survey costs. It will certainly not cover the leveraged loans or the breach of contract penalties from your developers. My mother walked out onto the stone porch, wrapped in a faded shawl, her eyes wide as she looked at the departing construction trucks and the naval police officers securing the coastal path. She looked at Clara, then at Richard, and finally at me, standing tall and resolute in my uniform. She saw the absolute shift in power, the quiet daughter now commanding the entire landscape. She took a step toward me, her hand reaching out, a silent plea for protection from the storm her own compliance had allowed to gather. I walked to her, took her hand gently, and looked back at my sister and her husband. I will ensure Mother is taken care of, I said, providing the definitive, reflective closure to the family drama. The house itself is outside the immediate construction footprint, and her residency will be protected under a specialized military caretaker protocol. But as for your holding company, Clara, you will have to navigate the civilian courts with the same ruthlessness you used against me. The coast now belongs to the Navy. They stood there, completely isolated on the gravel driveway, as my team began unloading the permanent security fencing to seal off the cliff paths. They had tried to play a game of legal chess against a woman who mapped global conflicts for a living, and they had lost everything before they even realized the match had begun. True strength doesn't require a loud voice or a boastful bank account. It resides in the quiet, disciplined execution of duty. Some people mistake quietness for weakness, forgetting that the quietest rooms in the world belong to strategic intelligence. Would you have warned your family about the naval easement, or let them spend their savings on a blocked project? If you've ever watched a sibling manipulate a parent for money, right, truth prevails below.